to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to discuss situations when you already have an advantage, how to win the simplest. Oftentimes, the easiest way is to exchange some pieces, especially when you already have a material advantage. Let's see some examples to this theme. Here we are, and in this position, White has an extra exchange, which means White has a rook versus Black's bishop, in addition to all other material that's even. If you look carefully, you'll notice that Black has a very serious threat, namely to checkmate White by playing Queen to h1. Of course, White could prevent that by, let's say, playing King h2, but in that case, Black would certainly give some checks and cause unpleasantness for White. So let's see what is the simplest way to win this game technically. Typically, when you are ahead material, you are looking forward to trade pieces, and especially queens. Now, what's interesting here is that here White not only wants to trade queens, but even if it costs some material to give back. So, this is what we're talking about. White gives a check on d4, forcing the Black king to move out, and then play Queen d5. Check. Obviously, this forces Black to trade queens, but Black wins a pawn along the way. So this obviously requires some calculation on White's part before we give a pawn back. But as you'll see, the pawn is very, very fast, and the Black king is very far away on the king's side and will arrive too late to catch the pawn. Black, let's say, plays King f8, b5, King e7, and the pawn advances further again to b6. Now Black is in serious difficulty because the pawn is about to advance further with the idea that if the Black bishop captures that pawn, then the White rook arrives on c7, making a fork. What happens, on the other hand, if the Black king gets closer to d6? Well, then the White rook will make a pin, and after King c6, simply rook captures the bishop on d5. And of course, the rook now is taboo, because if King takes rook, then simply the pawn advances to b7, and White's position is easily winning. Let's go back just a couple of moves and see what happens if the Black king instead moves to e6, not into the pin. Here the problem is not rook b1, in which case the Black bishop would for now block the pawn, but instead the rook would enter on c7, threatening to advance the pawn, and at the same time attacking the pawn on h7. And if the pawn moves up, then b7, and Black can prevent the pawn promotion only by giving the bishop up for the pawn. A very nice example when one side is willing to give back some of the material advantage in order to prevent the opponent's counterplay and the exchange of queens. Let's see the next example. That's a queen-knight versus queen-bishop endgame. In this position, White has two extra pawns, and typically that's a sufficient material advantage to win. Again, what White is looking to do is to simplify the situation. and namely by forcing the exchange of queens. This is from a real game between two former Soviet grandmasters, Yusupov White against Timoschenko. Yusupov continued with queen d7. Now the black queen is pinned, therefore black has no choice but to allow the exchange of the queens. Black responded by king b6, and now queen took queen, king took back, and typically for endgames, it's time to bring the king toward the middle of the board. White is gaining time by attacking the black bishop, which needs to retreat, and then the king arrives to e2. Black played king c6. Knight simply moved away, threatening to move to g5 to attack simultaneously black's f7 and h7 pawns, and the black bishop retreated to d8, preventing that, and white is persistent, playing f4, threatening with, again, the same idea to play knight g5. And black made everything they can to prevent that by playing h6, and white now is on a mission to create a passed pawn. King g4, king d3, and here, of course, there are several ways to win already, but I'll just show you quickly how the game itself continued. For a few more moves, of course, white has already a passed pawn along the a file and can easily create a second passed pawn on the king side. Bishop move to c3 and knight f5. At this point, it's quite clear that black is losing a second pawn and the end is real close. Let's move on to our third example. That's a game between Clark and the Hungarian Grandmaster Szabo. In this position, black has an excellent position, having control of the open C file, having a rook on the half open file on the same H file as where the white king is. Black also has a pair of bishops, so there are a whole bunch of things going for black. And here it's time to play a bit aggressively and move forward. Black's next move was knight to g4, check. The idea is that if the pawn captures the knight, then the black bishop makes a discovered check by capturing on d2. Therefore, white did not capture the knight, but instead of capturing, moved the king back to h1. And now this is the situation when black has no immediate way to win, but needs to look for a way how to simplify things and yet maintain their advantage. Black here continued by playing queen d4, a very powerful move, offering to trade queens, which white accepted, even though it was perhaps a better choice to move the queen to f3, attacking on f7 when black would respond by playing f5 and still maintain an advantage. But let's see how the game continued after the exchange of queens. Now black still has the control of the c file, black still has the pair of bishops, and of course the initiative. The knight is still hanging on d2 from the bishop on h6, and the knight had to move to b3, attacking the pawn on d4 at the moment. But now another simplification move by knight e3, attacking the white rook on f1. In the game itself, white now played knight takes pawn on d4, giving up on the rook on f1, but black had a relatively easy win after that. What would happen if white plays differently and does not give up the rook? Well, after knight takes knight, the pawn would capture back. And then the problem is that white doesn't have time to oppose the black rook on the c-file, because that would allow e2, which not only attacks the rook on f1, but also makes a discovered attack on white's second rook on c1. Let's go back just a couple of moves. After knight e3. On the other hand, if the white rook moves away from the attack, for example to f3, then black would trade the knight for the bishop, and of course, as always, have to look out for tactics with a nice little sacrifice with bishop h3. Black is winning material. Of course, if king takes bishop, bishop d2, and black is winning. Let's see our next example. Here we go. This is a very good example of calculation exercise. White here can make a very forceful move where black will have no choice but to continue with a series of forceful moves, and yet at the end of that variation, white will have a little combination to win significant material. I always suggest to first try to follow through with the forceful variations. And this is a perfect example of a trap that a weaker, less experienced player would fall into against a more experienced player. Let me show you what I mean. Here, after bishop takes knight, it's clear that black does not have the time to immediately recapture on c6 because their queen would be hanging on e7. However, you may see that black can play queen takes queen. And after pawn takes queen, still not capturing the bishop because then the rook would be lost on d8, but make a second intermediate move by checking on d1, and only now to recapture. Now at the moment, black is the one who is a pawn ahead, but yet white is the one who wins. Why is that? Well, not because of f6, which would be threatening checkmate with rook to d8, because then black would have the time to open a little window and escape with the king. White can do much better than that, namely by moving the rook up to d8 with a check, giving black only one choice by moving to g7, and now here comes the whole point of the previous sequence of moves. White plays f6 check. And now the black king can only move away in a way that leaves the rook in the corner unprotected. Very nice sequence. And now let's see a classic, a game that Bobby Fischer played in the 1960 US Championship against Grandmaster Bill Lombardi. Here we go. In this position, it's black's turn, and black already has a small material advantage, having an extra rook versus white's extra bishop and pawn. Obviously, there may be various ways to win this game, but the most effective one is to actually give back some of that material advantage and to transpose the game to a winning pawn endgame. Let's see how this works out. The first move is rook takes bishop. Check. Obviously, white has to recapture. And then rook captures e5. The king needs to move to a square that protects the rook. And then black happily exchanges. Now we have an pawn endgame with even number of pawns. However, the big difference is that black will be able to create an outside passed pawn. What that means is that that pawn can be used as a bait to keep the white king busy and go far away from all of his own pawns, while the black king will be able to capture each one after the other of the white pawns on the king's side. Let's see how this works out. Black would play king d5, king d2, and king c4. As you can see, black first optimizes the position of his own king. It's not hard to envision black's plan to play b6 followed by a5. That's the plan how black is creating a passed pawn. Sadly for white, there's nothing that can be done about it. White advanced by playing h5 and black played b6. Endgame king to c2. And here again, black optimizes his position before breaks through with h5. Black advances some of his pawns on the king's side. Right now, white could do en passant. However, it wouldn't help or wouldn't change the outcome of the game. White played h6. And black followed by playing f4. g4. And finally, black is ready to create a passed pawn. a5. Pawn captures and pawn captures. So now black has an outside passed pawn on the a file, and the white king needs to be busy with it. King b2 and a4. Now if the white king would go back to c2, black would just advance the pawn to a3, and then the pawn on c3 would fall after the white king will try to catch black's passed pawn. After a4, in this position, white continued by king a3, and simply king takes c3, and then the king, of course, just walks over to the other side of the board, and it's clear that all of the white pawns will be lost. A perfect example on simplification on how to avoid counterplay of your opponent and go for a sure win instead of trying at all costs keeping your material advantage. And let's see one more example on how to materialize an advantage. Let's see a classic game between two of the greats of American chess, Bobby Fischer and Samuel Reshevsky. They have reached this position after just 21 moves into the game. It's quite noticeable that black has two weaknesses, two weak pawns, the one on d6 and the one on h7. Both are being backward pawns, meaning they have a real hard time advancing. Although at the moment the h-pawn is threatening to advance to h5. and become a passed pawn. Therefore, White's next move is really important and urgent. White played g5 to blockade the advancement of the h-pawn, because from now on, even if that pawn would move up 2 squares, White will have the opportunity to capture that pawn by the en passant rule. Black retreated the bishop to e7. And now the question is how to increase the advantage for White. We know that the 2 pawns on d6 and h7 are weak, but the big question is how to attack them again. You may say, let's bring the rook back to d3 and then to h3 to attack it a second time. However, in that case, the black rook will at the same time conveniently move the rook to f8 and to f7, protecting it a second time. So the real question is how to make further progress. As so many times in chess, when your opponent has only one weak pawn or one weak square, it's usually not enough to win the game. Of course, if the other side defends well. When there are 2 weaknesses, that's already getting serious, but also still not always enough to win the game. There are times, like in this case, when we need to create a third target. So the opponent is too busy defending one or the other or the third weakness, and along the way something will get lost. Let's see how the American chess genius Bobby Fischer maneuvered and provoked a third weakness. In this position, he continued by playing king e2, which is a very flexible move. It allows, when and if needed, to bring the rook from h1 to d1 to put more pressure on black's pawn on d6, and of course still keeps the third rank open so the white rook can go to d3 and then to h3 if white chooses to. Another reason why the king move is quite good, because it puts the white king on a light color square. And the reason why that is important, because it's an opposite color square than where the black bishop can roam around and potentially give an unpleasant check. Black continued by playing rook a to f8, putting the rook on a half-open file, pressuring white's pawn on f2, and getting ready to put the rook on f7 if needed. White played a very natural move, simply developing the bishop to e3, and now black was simply on the waiting and moved the rook to c8. In this position, white can have several plans in addition to the plan that Bobby Fischer chose. Another possible idea was to advance the c3 pawn to c4 with the idea to then use the pin by playing c5. But I personally like Fischer's idea, which was to play b4 with the plan of on the following move to play b5. And then when the pawns trade, a third weakness is created on b7. Here black played b5, trying to prevent white's plan of advancing the pawn to b5. Of course, the problem with this is that white accomplished their goal, creating a third weakness, a third backward pawn in the a6 pawn. And now what white needs to do is try to go after those weaknesses. And the first step was retreating the rook to d1 to be flexible to go to a1. came king to e6, and the rook was ready to go after the pawn. Black protected it from c6, and now rook h3, ready to double on the h file. An important idea to remember, not to step in the pin when black would be able to play h5. So came rook to h3, ready to double the rooks on the h file, and black played bishop f8. So after rook h1, the rook is ready to defend the pawn from the 7th rank. And now, amazingly, black is in Zugzwang, which means that whatever move black makes, black has to worsen the position. The bishop cannot move to the 7th rank because the pawn on h7 would be lost. The rook must remain on the 7th rank in order to hang on to the pawn. The other rook on h8, again same reason, needs to protect the pawn. And if the black king moves to an illegal square, again the pawn on h7 can be captured. The game continued with d5, the only move that does not lose a pawn immediately. Fischer moved now the rook to a1, forcing the rook to protect the pawn, and now the d file is opening, and the white rook all of a sudden enters, creating a very unpleasant pin along the 8th rank. Came king f5, rook a8, tying down the black rook to the a6 pawn, rook e6, and rook h3, threatening with rook f3 skewer to win the bishop on f8. And black didn't find any other better solution than getting out of the pin by playing bishop g7, but that meant, of course, giving up on the pawn on h7. And now the win is pretty easy from here. White is a pawn ahead. Let me just real quick show you the end of the game. Rook e8, check, king g4, f3, king g3. And here the best move was to play king f1, and then black has hard time defending against the bishop check, followed by the rook checkmate on the h file. White won the game anyway after moving king to d3 instead of f1, but it took a bit longer. And now finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we are, a beautiful position where it seems that white is lost because the black pawn on a2 is about to get promoted, moreover with a check. In addition, the white rook is under attack at the moment. Seems like one of those positions where we almost may resign if we're careless. Try to figure out why would that be a big blunder, and how can still white save the game. And now, here is the solution. White should simply play bishop b2, but black can capture that. True, but then we'll play rook a4, again trying to give up our rook for the pawn, but the knight can capture it. And the black pawn is about to get promoted with a check. Very true, but still not giving black the win. The white king has to be careful where to move, but if it moves to the correct square, and there is only one of it, namely to f2, amazingly, but black cannot stop the white pawn from promoting, and objectively speaking, a queen and knight is not a sufficient material advantage against a queen to win the game. A beautiful endgame study. Thank you for listening, and I hope you improved your skills in winning a one game. So long, have you back in a week from now. Bye-bye.